Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I'm delighted to talk to Dr. David Warren. You're most welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Good to see you. David is a lecturer in the Department of Jewish, Islamic, and Middle Eastern Studies at Washington University in St. Louis, obviously in America. He is a scholar of contemporary Islam, politics, and media in the Middle East, with a particular focus on the understudied Arab Gulf states and Islamic soft power. David has kindly agreed to talk to us about Islamic soft power. Before we go to David, the other day I read the following remarks in an article published by the Council on Foreign Relations, which is an American think tank, and it said, in nearly every Muslim majority country, Islam is an important and sometimes the only ideological currency that mixes effectively with more standard realpolitik. With the decline of both socialism and pan-Arabism in the Middle East, the only real ideological competition to Islam comes from nationalism. But nationalism, by definition, is difficult to promote outside one's own nation. This means that governments, even relatively secular and progressive ones, have a powerful incentive to insert Islam into their foreign policy, using religious ideas to increase their prestige and promote their interests abroad. To deploy, in other words, what we call Islamic soft power. That's the expression. And the authors claim, to conclude, today's Muslim governments are attempting to shape religious discourse and control religious knowledge in order to pursue their own national interests. End quote. And as I said, that's from an article published by the Council on Foreign Relations, which I'll link to in the description below. So would you like to introduce us to this subject, David?
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul, for having me today. So just a little bit about me and sort of where I'm coming from with this subject. So as you mentioned, I've been teaching at Washington University in St. Louis since 2019. Prior to that, I was at University of Edinburgh in the UK. Oh. And my research interest with this subject is in how nation states, primarily in the Arab world, and their relationships with religious elites, and as you mentioned, how that comes together in what we call Islamic soft power, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
Back in 2021, I published a book on this subject, focusing in particular on Qatar and the UAE, particularly since the Arab Spring, and the way these two states foreground or background different scholars and different elites. More recently, part of our discussion today is a report I published for the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, discussing this, what we can term religious tolerance promotion by authoritarian states. For example, again, states like Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and other states too, will host conferences, sponsor high-profile scholars, publish declarations, all dedicated to the theme of religious tolerance promotion. And that particular report focused on how those efforts direct away from those states' human rights records in other regards. So we're speaking about both of these publications really today. So to get back to your question about this theme of Islamic soft power, first of all, then simply the phrase soft power itself is the counterpoint to hard power. Hard power being states using armies and force to coerce other states into doing what they want. Soft power is the opposite. The fact of how a state would use other means, non-coercive means, to have other states conform to their view of the world or support them in their policies, basically. And then Islamic soft power being how Islam is mobilized or brought into conversation with those efforts. So with that regard, with my own work, it generally, as with many of these things, oftentimes all roads lead to the Gulf, particularly, for example, states like Qatar, the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia also to some extent. And in my own work, I found that these states are often the most energetic when it comes to using their financial resources, enormous financial resources, to, again, religion or in general, or Islam in particular, isn't something that can be picked up and mobilized in a simplistic way, but rather what you can do is you can foreground certain interpretations at the expense of others, right? This could be by hosting conferences, sponsoring scholars, and things like that. And one of the things I found with my own work on the Gulf states is that I find these efforts, as you mentioned, are more directed internationally rather than internally. The Gulf states, given their sort of very sophisticated forms of internal repression, sophisticated police forces, and so on, don't really need Islamic legitimacy for their own population, for the purpose of legitimizing their governments in the eyes of their own populations, right? In contrast to other places, for example. So in that regard, then, when the Gulf states engage Islamic thinkers, they're often thinking internationally.
Right.
And a term I find helpful to think with in that regard is state branding. State branding means that states, particularly small states, or weak states, which it's worth bearing in mind the Gulf states are, despite their huge financial resources, all of the Gulf states, the smaller, particularly Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, etc., have all had territory claimed or occupied by their larger neighbors in their recent history, by Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, and so on. So despite their wealth and resources, they are particularly vulnerable. And so these states have to brand themselves, like companies in a way, in order to garner investment.
Oh.
And this investment, as it were, in the case of the Gulf states, comes in the form of larger outside powers, the US primarily, investing in maintaining the security of the regimes.
Right.
And there are many ways of doing this. But one way of thinking about how these states engage Islamic soft power is positioning themselves as essential allies of the United States in this post 9/11 world, of promoting, for example, moderate Islam or tolerant Islam, as these phrases are used. So that's one way of thinking about. So that's sort of the way these states will brand themselves, particular havens of a particular form of religion, in order to garner investment from the US or European states in preserving their security, but also in relation with other states across the Arab world as well. And so in this particular report I published recently, we're talking about how there has been a recent uptick, for example, in what can be called declaration proliferation, right? Since 2014, the declaration, the Marrakesh Declaration, a declaration of in the name of shared social values, in the name of tolerance of minorities and so on, was really set in motion a whole wave of conferences and declarations that will bring together scholars internationally, and which will culminate in a declaration of shared values, often named after a particular city like Mecca, Bukhara, Abu Dhabi, and so on and so forth. And it's a part of a new international trend whereby certain states will seek to position themselves as havens of dialogue and tolerance, which is all great and important things to do. But at the same point, they divert attention away from other issues. So that's really sort of where
suggesting this proliferation of declarations is aimed at mainly at an external international audience rather than an internal one, because you're juxtaposing the espousal of tolerance and diversity and dialogue with presumably Christians and Jews and others, contrasting that with what you call the authoritarian social system within the borders of those very same countries. So there's an interesting juxtaposition you're portraying there.
Yeah, so one of the things I put forward in this recent report and more recently is the fact that when we think about why these states do this, why, for example, the UAE would host major international conferences, bringing scholars together, as you mentioned, of Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and so on, to discuss, to engage in dialogue. Right?
Right.
It's not to say that those things aren't important or to sort of belittle those efforts by any means, but rather, one thing I talk about in my work recently is that tolerance performs a certain kind of labor that's different than the realm of states and law. So tolerance is a discourse that shifts the burden of responsibility for social peace from a state to a citizen, right? So tolerance is you tolerating me, I tolerate you. Our differences are due to a lack of understanding and things like that. Consequently, rather than the failure of a state to uphold human rights, to uphold the rule of law, or, for example, states perpetrating structural violence, by which I mean distributing resources unequally, or perpetrating direct violence, for example. So this discourse of tolerance is what's called sort of depoliticizing discourse, is that it moves conflict away from political analysis, sort of inequality, violence, and so on, to the realm of misunderstanding between citizens. Right? Mm-hmm. And so one of the reasons these states engage so energetically in these efforts of tolerance is that it puts the burden on you and me, or the burden on citizens, for responsibility for conflict and conflict solution, rather than responsibility on states in the realm of the rule of law and things like that, for example. Mm-hmm. So it's that kind of shift that I'm trying to think about when we engage in critique of not individuals who engage in those efforts, but rather the states that sponsor them, basically.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you for that. So let me just ask, the article that I quoted from earlier on, the Council on Foreign Relations article, contrasts what it calls Islam and Islamism. And this term Islamism has always confused me. I think I looked it up on Wikipedia once and saw dozens of different possible conflicting definitions. But what is Islam in your expert view, and how does it differ from Islam? How would you understand these terms, and how do they relate to each other?
Yeah, so really great question. I think when I was writing my own book in 2021, having to actually define what you mean by Islamism, you quickly start to realize the term doesn't have an objective use, I don't think, anymore. It's not a term I would really use in future. In my own book at the time, I used the term Islamist and Islamism to refer just to the Muslim Brotherhood.
Right.
Because Hassan al-Banna used a phrase called Islamiyun in the 1940s to refer to himself and his own followers. However, in this day and age, depending on who's using the term, Islamism effectively means something bad. I think.
Right.
And I think there's a clear politics of nomenclature, as a politics of naming things at work, either by academics who study Islam in general, or Middle East as a region, or participants in those conversations, of Muslims themselves, for example. And so if to denigrate or demonize a particular stream of thought or particular group which one has critiques of, to call it Islamist is part of that. And I think one thing I've noticed going back to my own work, particularly on Qatar and the UAE, I think I've noticed that we can think about a coming together of scholars who we might term neo-traditional, who have, in general, very deep concerns about what they consider to be modern corruptions of Islam, right? They use that term Islamism often to mean things that they consider to be modern or nefarious or corrupting influences. And for them, that often starts with Sayyid Qutb, Egyptian scholar from the middle of the 20th century. And so for them, usually it will mean him and those who read him and find his thought nourishing. And consequently, in their eyes, they will oftentimes portray a kind of a straw, not in more general conversations, not when they're being precise, but in more general discourse will mean to see sort of the essence of what they understand having gone wrong with Islam attributed to him. And they will argue that he represents A, the essence of the Muslim Brotherhood, and B, also that term gets expanded because people like Osama bin Laden, ISIS figures, and so on will read Sayyid Qutb as well. This term gets broadened to mean, on the one hand, the Muslim Brotherhood, all who sort of engage in non-violent democratic activism, all the way across to violent groups like ISIS and so on. At the same time, you have governments like the UAE who are deeply concerned about, on the one hand, violent groups like ISIS and whoever, but also non-violent activists like the Brotherhood. And so that term Islamism also is useful because it's such a broad term that brings in, if we think more in terms of British or America sort of countering extremism language too, what takes in what we would call, or what the British government call, non-violent extremism and
Yes.
violent extremism. This
Well,
idea.
I'm glad you mentioned the British experience. So I can only really speak from, because obviously I'm British from speaking from the UK, but is that there are good Muslims and bad Muslims. The good Muslims are Muslims. They're not radical. They're not Islamist. You know, they practice, they pray 5 times a day, they fast during Ramadan, etc., and they get on with their lives and integrate. And then there are the Islamists or the radicals. These are the dangerous guys, and they may have political ideas about Sharia, this word that frightens some people in the West, and just understanding of the divine law, its role in society. And this is particularly an issue in France, of course, which is much more hard-nosed secularist. But Islamism, in British context at least, seems to demonize what many would see as simply normative Sunni Islam, which is that Islam is not a private faith like some forms of contemporary Christian practice, which is just where you privately pray and you privately do your rituals, and it has absolutely no social and political relevance whatsoever. But Islam, of course, isn't like that at all. Normatively, it's always been had a public aspect to it, a social aspect to it, and politics is part, many would say, it's part of the DNA of Islam. It's not some kind of aberration that's to be contrasted with the real Islam. But I suspect what you're saying in the UAE context and other contexts, that the term has specific theological or intellectual antecedents. You mentioned Syed Qutb, for example, and his influence, alleged or real, on Al Qaeda and ISIS, and that's another facet of Islamism. But it seems to be so elastic and so loaded with pejorative connotations as to make it unusable as a simply a descriptive term that we can all kind of just use in everyday language.
Yeah, no, I think in general I would agree with you. I think it may have been, I forget who now, but other scholars have begun to argue now that, as you mentioned, the term Islamism should not really be used anymore as a descriptive term. I think it has become not usable, really. And I think certainly going forward, I would agree with that. I don't think it really has much relevance. Because you said it's used, it's so easily expanded or contracted depending on who you're trying to talk about, or who you're trying to sort of demonize or denigrate. I think also it's because all religious traditions and movements are so diverse as well, to try and pin down a particular thinker in a sort of very simplistic stream of thought, going from, for example, I don't know, a modern thinker to Sayyid Qutb to Ibn Taymiyyah to so on. It gets kind of absurd after a while to think that you can sort of draw these very clear lines of this person reads this person, reads this person, reads this person, when people don't work that way. But sometimes when we're talking about religion in general, or Islam in particular, because we work in a sort of secular framework, those kinds of arguments make sense to people, as obscure and odd as they are, if you were to try and make those arguments in other contexts. So intellectuals reading, sort of drawing a single line of intellectual thought, going back in some way.
Yeah, so I'm reading Ebba Said's book Orientalism at the moment, and the sense of the way that we in the West effortlessly impose our Orientalist categories on the Arab world. I think this might be one of them. Well, religion is a private matter, something you do between you and your God, and then you have Islam, of course, is like that because it's a religion, must be like Christianity, and then and you have these kind of alleged aberrations which are political and concerned with social justice and law and fairness and so on. But of course, it's all baloney, because Christianity itself, of course, has been very political, is still very political. In the United States, for example, Christians tend to elect presidents in the US, not mentioning anyone in particular, and they tend to fund and support other certain entities in the Middle East, which are not going to go into. So it's incredibly politicized, let alone the historic manifestations like Christendom, the Christian world, which was weaponized and state-run in the Christian world in the Middle Ages. So all these terms are very elastic and fluid.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you point out rightly there, when people use the phrase of what authentic religion ought to be, and when they might be imagining someone keeping their going to a particular building once a week to pray together, or keeping their beliefs private, or reading a particular text in a certain way, that is a very particular understanding of Protestant Christianity, right? The fact that the essence of religion is found in one sacred text that you read in your own language, seeing religious authority and religious elites as somehow suspect always. There's a long history, or seeing law, as you mentioned, religious law as somehow suspicious, again, has history before Islamophobia. History is anti-Semitism, of course. The idea of Christianity being a religion of love, and then
rejecting the Jewish law, which is all about legalism and works righteousness. This is how you earn your salvation. These are all tropes which, fortunately, have been debunked by recent biblical scholarship.
But again, going back to religions of love, religion of law, right? This older history has now been repurposed against Islam, right? And so I think this idea, which again sort of ignores all the other Christian traditions too, and sometimes these things get forgotten also when we talk about the way one imagines what religion ought to be. Is very, very particular to European history, which then has sort of percolated unevenly throughout the world. Colonialism.
I was going to say, European history, as self-understood by us Europeans, never includes Islam, even though we had a wonderful Muslim civilization in Andalusia, in the Iberian Peninsula, in Spain, for centuries, 6-7 centuries, which was the leading light of civilization in the whole of Europe. And that's kind of just quietly bracketed out and forgotten about when we talk about Europe today.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
I'm just curious to ask a further question about Islamic soft power as it's projected towards the West. What forms does it take? I'm thinking to the United States and to Europe particularly. You mentioned how it works perhaps internally with conferences and the proliferation of declarations, but in terms of the Western audience, by measuring the populations of the West, what forms does it take, do you think?
Well, I think there's a couple of interesting things to think about how what I would see, for example, in relation with the United States, who is sort of remains sort of the major ally for the Gulf states, for example, how the way the US has sort of engaged Islam has changed in recent years since 9/11, I would say. I think that, Selma Mahmoud wrote an article about this in previous years, how initially she wrote about how the US would initially see promoting secularism as the solution to what it understood as anti-US feeling in the Arab world in the aftermath of 9/11. And that would mean that the US, through funding NGOs and things like that, would see funding anyone that they identified as secular. But even they're critical of the US of supporting secularism in some form or other as the solution to the problem of anti-US sentiment. However, in recent years, I think going back maybe 10 years of the Arab Spring kind of time, that has changed, I argue, away from the US seeking to promote secular forms of Islam, rather to promoting what it perceives as authentic or traditional religious elites, because those who it perceives is kind of a coming together between a sort of conservative Christian right in the US and kind of a conservative Muslim right, both in the US and also in the Arab world too, around what authentic religion ought to be or what it should look like. And for example, we can see this phrase in a shift from Judeo-Christian civilization to Abrahamic civilization, right? You have this kind of, so rather than thinking about it more as sort of a West versus the East, more about how you now have some different constellations of groups that could be categorized as a more conservative religious right and a progressive religious left across in a more global sense now. I think is different now, rather than back in the initial post 9/11 period when sort of promoting secularism was the goal, and different states, different regions. And so, for example, different Arab regimes will position themselves as secular to sort of position themselves as allies. And now, I think, particularly with a state like, say, the UAE, you have a state that positions itself as promoting a form of authentic traditional religion, which is different now. And so there's been this shift, I think, in how states brand themselves in the eyes of, for example, the US.
But that's interesting. But there's also the case, I mean, one of the security worries of Western governments, as far as I can see, is what they call, I'm not saying this, what they call the spread of Wahhabism. There's a Wahhabi ideology, as they call it, which involves Saudi Arabia pumping lots of petrodollars into the West in terms of producing literature and dawah and building mosques, funding imams who go to mosques. It's a source of great anxiety, particularly in places like France, again, Germany, Britain to some extent. Is that still an ongoing? I'm thinking with the current rulership in Saudi, is this still their top priority? Is this still a thing? Is the West right to be worried about this? Is this just a form of paranoia, or because as the way Saudi presents itself, it doesn't see itself as in any way promoting terrorism. On the contrary, it sees itself completely against it for various reasons. Well, because of faith reasons, but other reasons as well. Is this concern legitimate in your view? And is it still is this soft power projection, in, if I can call it that, in the West, still a thing ongoing now?
Well, I mean, I've always avoided. I don't know what the word. Never had much interest in the coalescence between Islam and security studies. It's not something I particularly. The literature, I don't find the literature particularly enriching or particularly stimulating. So I don't think I can really. So yeah, I don't think there's been a kind of sort of cottage industry of terrorism studies, and that has emerged since 9/11. I don't think when you read that kind of work, you sort of oftentimes we don't really have much understanding of religion and how it really works. So this notion that religion will be picked up and make people do things in a sort of pathological way simply by reading a book is kind of bizarre. That's not how people work, right? You can't give someone a book, again, say a Qutbah or Ibn Taymiyyah or whoever, and then they'll act in a particular way simply based on reading literature. That's not how human beings work in the real world. So to perceive, to sort of portray, in my view, that's had a very unilinear fear of circulating literature as that alone. Because of course, as someone who's not that particularly interested in terrorism studies, my understanding, one of the debates would be, is that what comes first, sort of the literature or the grievance, right? And so, of course, for somebody in France or wherever, to read a piece of literature and find it inspiring to do something horrendous, you need to have a grievance first, right? Make that literature appealing, rather than simply reading a book produced by a Saudi press, for example. And I think that's where sort of the divide comes, and why. And if somebody was working for, say, a security service or something, there's a certain reticence, I think, to take those grievances seriously. I think we might say.
Okay.
So in that sense, I wouldn't necessarily find. I think it's not being as someone who works in that field. That's kind of a view. So I think, but yeah, I guess that's kind of my perspective on that, I would say. And what was the second part? The other part of that question was about. But with Saudi Arabia in general, I think what I found really interesting is that for so long, when people studied Saudi Arabia, there was this idea that the way it was portrayed, there was this sort of deal between the Wahhabi scholarly elite and the Saud family, which meant that the Saud family was dependent upon the Wahhabi elites with some very particular, deeply conservative social values for their legitimacy. But what's strange, I think, in the past few years with Mohammed bin Salman is that that elite and those values have kind of marginalized overnight, it seems. Again, and I think what one sees in sort of the way that those kinds of sort of society has been changed very, very quickly makes you wonder, like, was it so lacking in importance that you could simply dismiss many of those dismiss many of those of legal and social norms almost overnight, and so go in this very rapid social liberalization? Did it mean it was never that important at all in the first place?
Well, I did wonder. You see some of these, concerts that have gone on in, Halloween festivals allegedly sponsored by the authorities in Saudi Arabia. You wonder, had they been magnified out of all proportion? Is this what your average Saudi Arabian citizen experiences in life, or is this just kind of a highly specific series of events with the approval of MBS or not? I don't know idea, that are meant to make a point, but I'm not really changing the overall structure and mores of Saudi society. I mean, this is a huge different subject. I don't want to get into that, but I'm a bit suspicious of the glamorous sort of pop concerts or whatever we saw. If they are really, what are they really telling us about reality, and how much of this is kind of theatre and how much of it is real shifts? But anyway, these are questions. I don't have answers.
No, exactly, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. The other thing, coming back to the article on the Council of Foreign Relations, which I'll link to in the description below, in its conclusion, it says something quite interesting, and I think this is where we can bring it up to date, really, particularly with the World Cup, which just ended in Qatar. The article concludes, a shift is taking place around the world, it says, and this article was written a couple of years ago, as doubts build about the future of liberalism and the US-led liberal international order. The scare quotes are in the article. With the global consensus around liberalism fraying, more space is opening up for ideological combat. If the United States continues to withdraw from its role in promoting a predictable world order, competition around Islam, who defines it, who speaks for it, and who gets to mobilize it for their own ends, looks likely only to intensify. And whether that's true or not, that I have no problem with that as a statement. But what I'm interested in what I perceive, wrongly or rightly, is the Muslim world's growing popular confidence in pushing back against Western-backed secular liberalism and the US-led liberal international order, particularly flashpoints like the World Cup and the way that Qatar was singled out for alleged sins, alleged egregious behaviors, like having an Islamic understanding of relationships between men and women and men and so on, as if there was something that they should just cease to be Muslim for the sake of the World Cup. And of course, Qatar pushed back on that. And as did virtually the whole Muslim social medias, as I could see, it helped to galvanize and really give a sense of identity that the Ummah and the way, so I'm rambling on here, but the way Morocco was supported in a very non-nationalist way by Egyptians and everyone, all the Muslims around the world, identified with this football team, particularly because of what they did, not just winning games, but the way they treated their mothers and publicly acknowledged them and embraced them after match, the way they did sujood, where they did prayer to God after the match and maybe before the match and thanks for what happened. They were very explicitly a Muslim team, and this seemed to inspire an awful lot of people globally, as far as I could see from the social media. And is this kind of growing social popular confidence referenced in the article, is it going to have geopolitical ripples? Is it going to matter? Because we're not dealing here at state level so much, although it was organized by a state. We're dealing here with the man and the woman in the Arab street and elsewhere in London, particularly, really being inspired by this Islamically inspired, not just by football, but by a sense of pride or confidence in Islamic identity, which was transnational, Ummah-wide, rather than just nationalistic. Is this the thing that is this something going on here, you think?
That's a really interesting question, a really interesting thing to think about. I think I think one of the things that I sort of was thinking about and noticed during the World Cup, in a similar way, was there was lots of critiques of Qatar for sort of human rights record and so on, which are important to have their place. But I think what a lot of people noticed, things are picking up on, is that states and teams sort of grew a backbone when it came to a tiny Arab state in a way they wouldn't do with other states in the world. And I think that kind of disjuncture was noticeable, without meaning to belittle those critiques at all. At the same time, and then, as you said, the Qatari response was kind of a shrug of the shoulders. And similarly, also, an Arab media in general was kind of disinterested in that critique. At the same time, from the other side, too, of course, the other noticeable distinction also, which I think speaks to your point too, is about the very visible and vocal support for Palestine by supporters by a Moroccan team. And the Qatari government had no interest in sort of pushing, diminishing those. And that was very vocal by supporters being interviewed around Doha, in the stadiums, again, the Moroccans waving the Palestinian flag, which again was also similarly sort of ignored by the Western media, by and large, I think, especially in the US. And so I think, as you said, there's sort of this much more, sort of, if we could speak to a general disinterest in having terms of discussions dictated by a sort of a certain kind of Western set of norms, we might say. Bearing in mind, of course, that all religious traditions are incredibly diverse and can accommodate all kinds of views.
Okay. The other, my last question really is to do with your current work. Actually, you've written some books before, and I will link actually to your academia page where there's a number of fascinating articles that we can all just access by going to the link to look at your work, all centered around these themes we've been discussing. But what is your current book project?
It's my current project that I'm just starting, looking at the politics of interfaith dialogue, primarily in the UAE, but also the Gulf more broadly. Thinking about, again, sort of thinking about what it means to engage in interfaith dialogue in an authoritarian state. I think sometimes you have what I become more interested in the case of, say, the UAE. You have sort of sessions of interfaith dialogue that are sort of overseen by the UAE authorities. Sometimes you'll have sort of Emirati ministers from, say, the Ministry of Tolerance, right? Engaging also in interfaith dialogue between some Christian, Muslim, and Jewish figures. And I think the point is that what I'm interested in is what does that tell us about religion in the modern day? So how what are some of the issues seen in these dialogues? What is the problem that's seen and needing of being resolved? And oftentimes when we think of interfaith dialogue, we think about it happening in democratic contexts, like in the United States, the United Kingdom, or so on. But in a different kind of authoritarian context, what are these dialogues like? Is something that I'm looking at currently.
So this will be research turned into a book, presumably in due course. Is that
over the next few years? That's the plan.
Right. Okay. And just a final question about any other books you've written. What was your last book that you published?
Yeah, so the last book I published was in 2021, and it was called Rivals in the Gulf, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, Abdullah bin Bayer, and the Qatar-UAE contest over the Arab Spring and the Gulf crisis. And that book looked at these two sort of arguably kind of iconic figures, we might say. Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who passed away very recently, and then Abdullah bin Bayer, Mauritanian scholar based primarily in the UAE, and thinking back to the themes of our discussion so far, thinking about how these two states, Qatar and the UAE, had relationships between these two scholars, and the way those two particular scholars articulated political ideas as the Arab Spring unfolded, and came to these, who once they had a very close relationship, and came to diverge in 2013, 2014, and ultimately Sheikh bin Bayer came to sort of set up his own sort of rival enterprise, as it were, based in the UAE, because initially sort of Qatar was the state that really led the way with what we might call Islamic soft power, whereas in more recent years it's really become the UAE that has become the major state on the international stage, I think, arguably, in this regard.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating. Well, thank you very much indeed, Dr. David Warren from Washington University in the US. You obviously, I can tell, an Englishman like me. So, and you went to, I think you did your PhD at the University of Manchester, was it, here in England?
Yes, that's right. I did my PhD in Manchester, then I worked in Edinburgh for a while, and then came out to St. Louis since 2019.
Gosh, three fantastic. I was in Edinburgh myself a few months ago, an amazing city. I went to the university there. Beautiful, beautiful campus. Some of the buildings are amazing. But anyway, thank you very much indeed for your time, your expertise, and I'm sure this will be great benefit. And I'll link to the article and the Academia page, etc., in the description below, where we can all benefit further from your research. Thank you very much. Till next time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.